The ambulance didn't slow down. It hit the emergency bay at Harlow General doing 40 miles an hour, and the back doors flew open before the wheels stopped spinning. 3 paramedics spilled out screaming numbers nobody inside was ready to hear, but nobody was looking at the ambulance. They were looking at her. A woman in a faded jacket stood at the edge of the ER entrance, a battered field bag hanging from one shoulder, watching the chaos with the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't panicking. She was reading the room, and in about 4 hours, every doctor in that building would understand exactly what that stillness meant and why they should have been terrified of it from the start. If you want to find out what happens when the person everyone dismissed turns out to be the most dangerous person in the room, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The rain had been falling on Crestwood, Ohio for 6 straight hours by the time Claire Vasquez showed up to Harlow General Medical Center with a resume nobody believed and a bag that looked like it had survived something it shouldn't have. She was 32, medium height, brown hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style. The kind of face that didn't ask for attention, and on most days didn't get it. She wore a navy fleece over dark scrubs, not the hospital-issued kind, just the kind you bought when you planned on being practical rather than impressive. Her boots had seen better decades. The woman at the staffing desk, a round-faced woman named Donna with reading glasses perpetually perched on her head, squinted at the paperwork Claire slid across the counter. "Temporary position?" Donna asked, not looking up. "Trauma rotation. I was called in through the agency." Donna typed something slowly. Waited. Typed again. "Says here you've been out of civilian practice for a while." "A while," Claire agreed. Donna glanced up. She had the look of someone deciding whether to ask more or move on. She moved on, stamped the form, and handed Claire a temporary badge with a color code that meant "Don't touch anything important." The ER at Harlow General was the kind of place that ran on controlled chaos and institutional pride. Not always in that order. It was a Level 2 trauma center with ambitions of being a Level 1, which meant the staff carried a certain particular energy, half competence, half performance. The corridors were wide and perpetually lit with fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. The smell was familiar to anyone who'd spent time in medicine. Antiseptic layered over something older, something human. Claire stood at the nurse's station on the main trauma floor and waited to be assigned. Around her, the evening shift was doing the careful handoff shuffle, checking charts, exchanging shorthand updates, not making eye contact with the new face at the edge of the room. A charge nurse named Priya Okafor was the first person to actually look at her. Priya was 40, efficient, with the quiet authority of someone who had outlasted 4 different department chiefs and intended to outlast 4 more. She walked over with a tablet, gave Claire a once-over that was not unkind but was definitely thorough. "You're the agency nurse." "Claire Vasquez." "Priya, you'll be with me tonight." She glanced at the bag. "What's in that?" "Field kit." A pause. "We have supply carts." "I know." Priya studied her for another half-second, then seemed to make a decision to table that conversation and move forward. She handed Claire a printed floor layout. "We've got a full board tonight. Chest pain in 4, possible appy in 7, an elderly fall in 2 that I'm not happy about." "Start with the fall." "Mrs. Kaminsky, 81, right hip. She's been waiting 40 minutes, and she's getting loud." "Got it." "Vitals are in the system. Just keep her calm." Claire picked up her bag and went. She found Mrs. Kaminsky sitting upright on a gurney in Bay 2, one hand clutching the bed rail, the other holding a crumpled tissue she clearly hadn't used for crying, more for something to grip. She was small, white-haired, furious in the specific way of people who have been in pain for too long and are done being patient about it. "You're not a doctor," Mrs. Kaminsky said immediately. "No, ma'am. Nurse. The last one who came in here was a medical student. He was guessing." "I'm not guessing." Claire set down her bag, glanced at the chart on the wall monitor, then crouched slightly so she wasn't talking down at the woman. "You fell at home. Right side took the impact. Does it hurt more when you breathe or just when you move?" Mrs. Kaminsky blinked. "Move. Mostly." Sharp or a deep ache? Deep, like something's sitting wrong. Okay. Claire was already checking the position of the hip, not pressing, just observing alignment. The X-ray order's already in the system. We're waiting on a suite. I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you on blood thinners? A pause. My husband says I shouldn't tell people that. Your husband isn't here, and it will affect your treatment. Mrs. Kaminsky looked at her for a long moment. Warfarin for 3 years. Thank you. Claire made a note on the tablet. I'll flag it. It changes the protocol if there's a fracture. She adjusted the pillow under the woman's leg without being asked, then straightened. Someone will be in soon. If the pain gets sharper, press the call button. Don't tough it out. You're different, Mrs. Kaminsky said, almost to herself. Claire had already turned toward the door. She was halfway back to the nurse's station when she heard it, a voice like a door slamming, and not in a polite way. Who authorized this? Dr. Marcus Holt was standing at the nurse's station, holding a printed form in one hand like evidence. He was the kind of man who had arranged his entire physical presence to communicate authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, white coat pristinely pressed, ID badge positioned at exactly chest height. He was the ER department chief, and he had arrived 12 minutes into the shift with the energy of someone who had already decided something was wrong. He was 46. He had an MD from an institution he referenced often, and a particular way of looking at people that sorted them immediately into categories: useful and not useful. He was looking at Claire's temporary badge. The Hollis Agency, Donna said from behind the desk. Coverage for tonight. We're down 2 staff. I know we're down staff. I approved a licensed ER nurse, not... He looked at the badge closer. A general nursing placement. He said general the way people say amateur. Where's her credentials review? It's in the system, Dr. Holt. I don't want it in the system. I want it in my hand. He finally looked at Claire directly. You've been out of active clinical practice for... how long? 4 years from civilian medicine, Claire said. From civilian medicine. He said that like she'd told him she'd been practicing veterinary care. And what have you been doing in the interim? Medical work? Different setting. Different setting, he repeated. He was already done with the answer. He turned back to Donna. Get me someone from the agency who has current ER-specific credentials. Tonight. This one can assist, but I don't want her near critical cases. He glanced back at Claire once. Paperwork's short-staffed, too. Start there. He walked away before she could respond. Not because he was in a hurry, because he'd already classified her as handled. Priya appeared at Claire's elbow from nowhere, the way experienced charge nurses always seem to materialize exactly where they were needed. Don't, she said quietly. Don't what? Make an issue of it. I wasn't going to. Priya studied her. Most people would be. I'm not most people. Claire looked toward the paperwork bay. Where do you need me actually useful? Priya was quiet for a moment, then, Bay 7. The possible appy? The resident in there is 27 years old, and he's never met a patient who wasn't reassured by his presence. This one isn't. She's 17, she's scared, and she keeps asking questions he can't answer in a way she understands. Claire went to Bay 7. The patient was named Jamie, 17, cornrows, a soccer warm-up jacket, and the specific tight expression of a teenager trying extremely hard not to cry in front of adults. The resident, a tall young man whose name tag said Dr. Elliot Marsh, was mid-explanation of what an appendix was when Claire came in. He did not seem pleased to be interrupted. I was just... Keep going, Claire said. I'll check vitals. He kept going. Claire listened with one ear while she worked. Pulse, temp, the way Jamie was holding her body. The involuntary guard when anything got near her lower right quadrant. She noted the time since symptom onset on the chart. She noted it again because the resident had logged it wrong. When Marsh finished, Jamie said, But does it have to come out? Marsh opened his mouth. That depends on what the imaging shows, Claire said, before he could commit to an answer that wasn't his to give. The CT will tell us more. What I can tell you right now is that your pain pattern is consistent with what we're looking for, which means we're in the right place, running the right tests. You're not being overdramatic. You're not wasting anyone's time. You came in at the right moment. Jamie exhaled slowly. Some of the tightness in her jaw loosened. Marsh waited until they were in the hallway to say, quietly and with the measured frustration of someone choosing their words carefully, "I had it under control." "I know," Claire said. She wasn't being sarcastic. She needed a different voice for a minute. "It happens." He looked at her ID badge, the temporary marker. He looked away. She knew what that meant. The shift moved forward the way bad nights always did, not in a flood, but in a slow accumulation of complications. The chest pain in Bay 4 upgraded itself to something requiring a cardiologist. The elderly fall became a confirmed hip fracture and a warfarin concern that Claire had already flagged, which meant when the orthopedic resident arrived, he found the notes waiting. He read them, looked for whoever wrote them, and when someone pointed at Claire across the room, he nodded once with the neutral acknowledgement of someone noting an unexpected competence. Nobody mentioned it to Holt. Nobody mentioned much of anything to Holt when they could avoid it. Holt swept through the department twice in the first 3 hours. The second time, he passed Claire while she was updating discharge paperwork at the station, exactly where he'd put her, and didn't stop. But she caught the look. The quick scan to confirm she was where she was supposed to be. The fractional nod of someone satisfied that the order of things was maintained. At around 9:45, a second-year nurse named Brandon stopped next to Claire at the printer and said, not quietly enough, "How long have you been in nursing?" "About 10 years. "Wild," he said, like it was a curiosity rather than a statement. "You seem like you'd be good at it." "I am good at it," Claire said. Brandon blinked. He'd expected deflection, a laugh, a thanks, a trying my best, not a statement delivered with the same flat certainty as checking a blood pressure result. He didn't know what to say, so he took his pages and left. Priya, who'd been 3 feet away organizing a supply cart, said nothing, but something shifted in the way she was looking at Claire. At 10:15, an ER attending named Dr. Simone Adler came to find Claire in the corridor. Adler was 50-ish, sharp-featured, with the energy of someone perpetually operating on insufficient sleep and making peace with it. She'd been the one actually managing the floor while Holt circulated between his office and his authority. "The hip fracture," Adler said. "Mrs. Kaminsky. Her daughter called. She said her mother told her, and I quote, 'The nurse with the old bag was the only one who actually listened.'" Adler looked at Claire. "She specifically flagged the warfarin. Ortho said if we hadn't caught it, we'd be looking at a very different post-op situation. It was in the intake history. Nobody had pulled it yet." "I know." Adler seemed like she wanted to say something more. Instead, she said, "You worked field medicine, the paperwork says." "That's right." "Where?" A pause, just long enough to be intentional. "Overseas. It wasn't in a hospital setting." Adler studied her the way doctors study patients, looking for what isn't being said. "Holt's going to keep you on paperwork." "I know." "Doesn't seem like it bothers you." "The work gets done," Claire said, "wherever I'm standing." Adler left. Claire went back to her station. At 10:40, her radio crackled. Not the hospital intercom, a sound everyone else registered as nothing because they were paying attention to the right systems. It came from a device clipped inside her jacket pocket that no one had noticed, emitting a tone that lasted exactly 1 second. She looked at it, read the notification, put it back. Her expression didn't change, but she crossed the floor to where Priya was standing and said very quietly, "I need you to know something." Priya turned. "What?" "Tonight's going to get complicated. I need you to trust me about that even before you have a reason to." Priya stared at her. "What does that mean?" "It means when things move fast, stay close to what I'm doing, not what's being said about what I'm doing. Can you do that? Are you going to tell me why?" "Not yet." Priya was quiet for 5 full seconds. The kind of quiet that comes from someone genuinely deciding something rather than performing deliberation. "I'll stay close," she finally said. That was all Claire needed. At 11:03, the lights in the east wing flickered twice. Nobody paid attention. Lights flickered in old hospitals. It was practically tradition. At 11:11, the scanner on the charge desk lit up on the EMS channel, the one that ran background through every shift, white noise that experienced nurses listened to with half a brain while using the other half for everything else. A voice came through mid-sentence, flat and controlled in the way that training produced but adrenaline tested. Multiple casualties, Bellevue Crossing Station, eastbound Regional Express, partial derailment, initial count unclear, requesting all available. The desk went quiet. Not silent, quiet. The specific vacuum of a room where 12 people have all stopped breathing at the same moment. Then everyone started moving at once, and the words train derailment became the only words in the building that mattered. Priya was already on the phone. Adler was moving toward the trauma bays, tablet up, rerouting resources before the information had finished transmitting. Brandon knocked over a supply tray in his hurry, and nobody stopped to pick anything up. Holt appeared from the direction of his office, as if he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, which, in a sense, he had. Mass casualty events were the metrics that defined trauma centers. How a department performed in the first 90 minutes was the kind of thing that got cited in reviews, reputation builders, grant applications. He pulled Adler aside. What are we looking at? Commuter train, Bellevue Crossing. Could be 40, could be 100. We don't have a number yet. Alert the trauma teams. Get surgical on call. I want triage zones established in the ambulance bay and the main corridor. We're not running this through the standard intake. Already in motion, Adler said. Good. He turned to survey the room. His gaze landed on Claire, who was already reorganizing the supply cart near Bay 1. Not frantically, not performatively, just systematically moving things into an order that made more immediate sense for what was coming. He pointed at her. You, field triage, ambulance bay. You can flag and sort incoming, keep the deck clear for clinical teams. Don't make assessment calls. Understood, Claire said. She took her bag and went to the ambulance bay. The rain was still falling. The bay was concrete and open on 3 sides, lit by overhead floods that turned everything the same washed-out yellow. 2 paramedics were already repositioning their rigs to create space. One of them, a woman with dried blood on her gloves from a prior call, gave Claire a look that was purely logistical. Who are you, and can you help? Where do you want the secondary staging? Claire asked her. The paramedic blinked. We usually use the east lane for overflow. East lane's going to be blocked in about 12 minutes when the first 4 rigs arrive simultaneously. If you move the barrier to the north end and angle the first 2 units, Claire pointed, mapping out the space with a precision that stopped the paramedic mid-thought. You get 4 simultaneous offloads instead of 2, and you keep the critical path clear to the main door. The paramedic looked at where she was pointing, looked at Claire. Yeah, she said. Yeah, okay. She turned and started shouting at her partner. Claire was already moving the first barrier. The first ambulance arrived at 11:29, then 2 more, 40 seconds apart, then 4 more, in a cluster that would have gridlocked the standard layout completely. They didn't gridlock it. Claire was in the bay, field bag on her back, moving between gurneys as they came off the rigs with the rhythm of someone who had done exactly this in conditions considerably worse than a well-lit Ohio hospital on a rainy Tuesday. She called out triage classifications in the shorthand that emergency medicine used everywhere, colors, levels, system flags, and she did it without the clipboard, without pausing to double-check, without the half-second hesitation that marked someone who was working from training rather than from somewhere deeper. Chest trauma, tension risk, priority 1, he goes straight through. Leg fracture, stable pulse, field tourniquet in place, priority 2, east lane. Oh, this one's walking and talking. Get her inside and seated. She's going to crash from shock in about 10 minutes. The paramedics were moving with her. Not behind her, not around her, with her. Something about the cadence of her commands had calibrated them without announcement, and the bay was running cleaner than it had any right to. Inside, it was less clean. Adler was managing 4 trauma bays simultaneously, and the surgical teams were still assembling from on-call. Marsh was in over his head and being managed by a senior resident who was also in over his head, just with better composure. The monitors were screaming. 2 nurses were arguing about which room had the working ultrasound machine. A charged desk phone had been ringing for 2 minutes that felt like 20. Holt stood in the center of it with the expression of a man whose plan was encountering reality at speed. He'd trained for mass casualty scenarios. He'd run drills. But drills were clean and timed, and everyone knew their lane. This was 37 people arriving in 11 minutes, several of them in conditions that required decisions he hadn't expected to make simultaneously, and the specific controlled chaos he'd always imagined he'd command was revealing itself as considerably more chaotic than controlled. He made a decision about the overflow ward. It was the wrong decision. Adler caught it and redirected quietly, without making it a moment. He made a decision about surgical priority. That one was right, but slow. At 11:42, Claire came through the main doors from the bay with a patient beside her on a gurney, a man in his 50s, paramedic jacket, clearly one of the first responders who'd been in the train car when it went down. She was bagging him manually while rolling the gurney with her other hand, which should not have been physically possible and was, because she'd propped the bag in the specific position that allowed it. Brandon saw her first. His mouth opened. "Bay 3, Claire said before he could say anything. "It's free. He needs bilateral chest assessment, possible hemothorax on the right. He's been compensating for at least 20 minutes. Get Adler." Brandon moved. Claire moved with the gurney. Holt stepped into her path, not deliberately. He'd turned and she'd been closer than he expected. For a half second they were face to face, and he was looking at her hands, which were still managing the patient, and at her face, which was completely, utterly focused. "What's the status in the bay?" he said. 17 processed, 11 inside. 2 priority ones still en route, ETA 4 minutes. You need to prep bay 6, so the current configuration won't handle the airway case that's coming. How do you know that there's an airway case? Because EMS radioed it 90 seconds ago, and I was standing there. She moved around him. "Bay 6, Dr. Holt." He stood still for a moment. Then he turned and went to Bay 6. By midnight, the emergency department at Harlow General looked like something between a military field station and organized chaos. Heavy emphasis on the field station. Every bay was occupied. The corridor outside had become an auxiliary ward. Nurses and residents were moving in patterns that had, somewhere in the last hour, stopped being individual and started being collective. Claire was the thread running through it. She wasn't commanding. She wasn't lecturing. She moved, assessed, flagged, adjusted, and the people around her responded without fully understanding why. The way that people fall into step with someone who is moving in exactly the right direction. Priya had stayed close. She'd watched, and she'd helped, and at one point she'd looked across a crowded corridor at the woman she'd met 3 hours ago and thought, "I have seen a lot of nurses in this building. She is not one of those nurses." At 12:17, the ambulance bay radio crackled again. Not EMS this time. Military frequency. Encrypted prefix. The paramedic who caught it looked up from her radio with an expression she couldn't quite parse. Surprise wasn't the right word, but confusion wasn't either. She said, "I'm getting a military channel ping. That's not a thing that happens." 3 minutes later, headlights appeared at the end of the hospital drive. Not ambulances. Vehicles. Dark ones. Moving in formation. They pulled into the drive with the quiet efficiency of things that had been positioned before anyone thought to ask who'd positioned them. 4 vehicles. Black plates. No visible insignia until they stopped and the doors opened. The men and women who got out were not police. They were not federal agents in the sense anyone on the staff would recognize. They wore tactical uniforms without rank insignia showing, and they moved in a pattern that the ER staff, watching through the bay windows, couldn't quite name. One of them walked directly to the ambulance bay entrance. He was perhaps 40, lean, with a face that had been outdoors for most of its life. He spoke to the paramedic at the door. "We're looking for the medical officer managing this bay." The paramedic, confused, pointed inside. "There's a Dr. Holt." "The one in the bay?" the man said. "The woman." The paramedic paused, then pointed at Claire, who was 40 feet away across the bay, not looking at them, finishing an assessment on an incoming patient. The man in the tactical uniform looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his face, something that might have been relief or recognition, or both simultaneously. He walked toward her. and the entire ambulance bay went quiet in the way things go quiet when something is about to change the shape of the room. He stopped 3 feet behind her. She didn't turn around immediately, finished what she was doing first, a quick but complete assessment, professional priority over anything else. Then she turned. They looked at each other. "Captain Vasquez," he said, and he brought his hand up in a salute, crisp, formal, absolutely real. The paramedics, the nurses who'd drifted close, Brandon, who'd followed a supply cart out and then forgotten why. They were all watching. Claire held the man's gaze for a moment. "Staff Sergeant Delacroix," she said. Her voice was steady. It had always been steady. "I wasn't expecting you." "Neither were we," Delacroix said. "But we got word you were here, and we have a situation inside the building that needs medical oversight from someone with clearance to handle it." He glanced once at the crowd around them. "Your clearance is still active." "Ma'am." The word landed in the bay like something solid. Ma'am. The kind of ma'am that had nothing to do with politeness. The kind that meant rank. Brandon was looking at Claire's worn fleece and her battered field bag, and the temporary badge with the color code that said, "Don't touch anything important." Priya had come through the bay doors and was standing at the edge of the group. She looked at Claire's face, then at the military personnel fanning out professionally around the bay. Claire looked at Delacroix for exactly 1 more second. Then she said, "Show me the patient." She walked past the entire crowd without looking at any of them, and Delacroix fell into step beside her, and the two of them went through the hospital doors, and the bay lights kept flooding everything that same washed-out yellow, and nobody in that ambulance bay said a single word, not even Holt. Because Holt was standing in the bay doorway, he'd come out to see the vehicles, and he was looking at the space where Claire Vasquez had just walked, and his face had a specific quality to it. Not confusion, something quieter than confusion. Something that looked, for the first time all night, like a man who was not entirely certain he understood the situation he was in. Holt stood in the bay doorway for 11 seconds. Nobody counted, but it felt like 11 seconds. That specific interval of stillness that sits between understanding something intellectually and feeling it land. Then his pager went off and he went back inside. Because the building still had 39 patients in it, and the world, despite all appearances, had not stopped for his moment of recalibration. But the residents who'd watched from the corridor windows kept watching even after he left. Brandon had his phone out, not recording, just holding it, like he'd reached for it instinctively and then couldn't remember what he'd meant to do with it. The paramedic who'd gotten the military radio ping was standing very still near her rig with the expression of someone mentally reconstructing a conversation they'd had an hour ago and finding that it meant something different now. Priya went back inside through the main doors. She moved through the department the way she always moved, with purpose, with the forward lean of someone who had things to do and intended to do them. But she was tracking something now that she hadn't been tracking before. The corner of her eye kept finding the door to Bay 9, which was where Delacroix had taken Claire. Bay 9 was the isolation suite. It wasn't used for isolation much. They didn't have the volume for it. Mostly it served as a secondary trauma room when the main bays were full, which tonight they all were. But someone had cleared it in the last 20 minutes, because when Priya walked past, the glass window was covered on the inside with the privacy curtain, and there were 2 of the tactical personnel standing outside the door with the specific stance of people who were not standing there for their health. She kept walking. She had a patient in Bay 4 who needed a medication reassessment, and the corridor near Bay 7 had a backlog she needed to untangle. And Holt was moving toward her with the energy of a man who'd decided that decisiveness was the correct response to confusion. "The military personnel," he said. "Have they interfaced with any of our staff besides—" "Not yet," Priya said. "I want to know what's in Bay 9. "I imagine they'll tell us when they want us to know." "This is my department," Holt said. The words came out with the cadence of habit rather than anger, like he was reminding himself as much as her. Priya looked at him with the calm of someone who had made a decision about this conversation before it started. "Then run your department, Dr. Holt. I've got patience." She left him in the corridor. Inside Bay 9, it was quieter than the rest of the building in the way that deliberate quiet is different from accidental quiet. The patient on the table was a man in his late 40s, lean, gray at the temples, wearing civilian clothes that had the specific, non-specific quality of someone who bought them not to be memorable. His left arm was splinted field style. Someone had done it in the field, someone who knew what they were doing. He had a laceration above his right eye that was controlled but deep. His breathing was the thing Claire had noticed first, because it was the thing that needed immediate attention. Shallow, slightly irregular, the signature of someone managing pain by restricting breath rather than from pulmonary compromise. Ribs, she'd thought in the first 2 seconds. Not just the arm. He was conscious, alert, and looking at her with an expression she recognized, not because she knew his face, but because she knew the look. The look of someone who has been in bad situations and is currently running a continuous assessment of which category this one belongs in. "I'm Vasquez," she said. "I'm going to look at your side." He said nothing, which was also something she recognized. She pressed carefully below the left ribs. He didn't wince, controlled the wince, which was worse. Deep breath. A pause. Then he breathed, and the slight catch at the top told her what she needed. 2, maybe 3 ribs. No pneumo. You're moving good air on both sides. The arm was already managed. She straightened. Whoever splinted you in the field did it right. "One of Delacroix's people," the man said. His voice was lower than she expected. Careful. "Smart team." She was already reaching for supplies. "I'm going to wrap the ribs and close the laceration. You're going to want imaging, but that'll take time. Can you tell me your pain level on a 1 to 10? A pause. 4. She looked at him flatly. 6, he said. "There you go." She pulled a chair to his bedside and began prepping the lac closure. "Are you allergic to anything I should know about?" "Sulfonamides." "I wasn't going to use sulfonamides, but noted." She opened the kit. Her movements were economical, not rushed, not slow. The kind of motion that had the quality of something practiced until it stopped being practiced and just became what the hands did. "Do you want to tell me your name, or are we doing this anonymously?" The man looked at Delacroix, who was standing near the door. Something passed between them. Not hesitation, more like confirmation. "Reeves," the man said. "Daniel Reeves." The name meant nothing to her, or rather, it meant the kind of nothing that meant it was probably not his name, but that was fine. She wasn't his clearance officer. She was his medic. "Okay, Reeves." She began cleaning the laceration. "This is going to sting." "I know." "I know you know. I say it anyway." He almost smiled. The pain reached his jaw before it got there, but it was close. Delacroix waited until she'd been working for a few minutes before he spoke. He'd positioned himself in the corner, not from the room, but from the immediate visual field of anyone who might look through the door gap. "We got notified you were here by secondary channel," he said. "Not official. Someone ran your agency registration and flagged it." "Flagged it to who?" "Unit tracking. Your inactive profile still runs in the system. Certain keywords trigger a notification." He paused. "Trauma nurse placement at a civilian level 2 facility in the same metro area as an active operation. I wasn't placed for operational reasons. I needed work, and this was available." "I know. But the coincidence got flagged, and we had an asset already in transit with a medical need, and your clearance is still active, you said." She tied off the first suture. "How?" "Not a question exactly. More the way you say something when you already know the answer and want to see if you'll be told the truth." "Your discharge wasn't finalized the way it was processed on paper," Delacroix said carefully. She stopped working for exactly 1 second, then continued. "Say that again clearly." "Your administrative separation, the paperwork that went through after Operation Harlan Point." He said the name quietly, the way you said things in rooms where walls had ambiguous loyalties. "It was filed, but there's a classification level above it that was never resolved, which technically means I was never fully out," Claire said. "On paper." "I've been out for 4 years, Delacroix." "On paper," he said again. And the 2 words just sat there. She looked at him across the room. He met her eyes steadily, the way people did when they were delivering information they didn't write and weren't responsible for but were choosing not to be sorry about. She went back to work. What does Reeves have to do with Harlan Point? Delacroix didn't answer immediately, which was, itself, an answer. Outside Bay 9, the department was running itself in the messy, functional way that emergency medicine operated under pressure. Not beautifully, but adequately, with the specific grace of people doing difficult things and mostly not dropping them. Adler was the load-bearing wall. She'd taken over the surgical priority queue, managed the overflow corridor, and was currently on the phone with the attending in cardiology with the crisp frustration of someone who had asked for a callback 20 minutes ago. Holt was moving through the department with the look of a man trying to look like he was in command of a situation he was 2 steps behind. He wasn't incompetent. That was the complicated thing about him. He was capable, experienced, and had almost certainly done excellent work in the 10 years he'd been chief. But excellence in standard conditions and excellence in the conditions of tonight were different muscles, and he'd spent long enough as an administrator that some of the clinical muscle had softened. He pulled Marsh aside near the supply corridor. Marsh was tired, the specific, hollowed-out tired of a resident past the 10-hour mark in a mass casualty situation. "The woman from the agency," Holt said. "What do you know about her?" Marsh looked at him carefully. "Vasquez?" "Her background, field medicine," she said. "What field?" "Where?" "She didn't eat." Marsh stopped. "She didn't say. She just said overseas. She corrected my intake time on the appendix case," he added, then seemed to immediately regret mentioning it. Holt's jaw moved. "Did she?" "It was a minor. She's a temporary agency placement, Elliot. She's not a senior clinician. She should not be making corrections to attending charts." "It was a resident chart, actually, and she was right, so that's not the point." Marsh looked at him for a moment. He was 27 and tired and smart enough to understand several things simultaneously. That Holt was technically correct about protocol, that Holt was using protocol to process something that wasn't really about protocol, and that saying so would be professionally inadvisable. "Okay," Marsh said. "Was there something specific you needed?" Holt looked toward the end of the corridor where Bay 9 was. "When she comes out of there," he said, "I want to know immediately." "Sure," Marsh said. "Yeah." He went back to his patient. Holt stood in the corridor for a moment longer, and the look on his face wasn't the administrator's look or the physician's look, but something older and less managed. The look of a man running a private calculation and not liking the results. "Ah!" Claire had finished suturing by the time Delacroix actually answered her question. He'd spent the interim organizing his thoughts, which she recognized because it was the same thing she did. Not stalling, just refusing to be imprecise about something that mattered. "Reeves was embedded with an oversight group reviewing defense contract compliance," Delacroix said. "Has been for about 14 months. The train derailment tonight wasn't an accident." The room got quieter than it already was. "We don't have confirmation yet," he added quickly. "But the vehicle that struck the train at Bellevue Crossing, the preliminary from the scene suggests deliberate placement, and Reeves was on that train." Claire looked at Reeves. He was watching her with the same careful steadiness as before. "The operation he was overseeing," she said. "What's it connected to?" Delacroix glanced at Reeves again. Reeves gave a minimal nod. "A medical contract audit," Delacroix said. "Specifically, defense adjacent. Supply chain irregularities connected to a series of medical facilities that held federal contracts during a particular period." Claire had gone very still. "What period?" she said. "Roughly 8 to 11 years ago. The overlap period with classified forward operations in 3 theaters." He paused. "Including the theater where your unit operated." She put down the instrument she'd been holding, carefully. The way you put things down when your hands need to not be doing anything else for a moment. "You're telling me that what Reeves was investigating, what someone put him on a train to stop him from delivering, connects to Harlan Point." "We're telling you it's possible," Delacroix said. "We're not telling you anything's confirmed. But the reason we're here at this hospital specifically is because the documents Reeves was transporting..." He stopped. "Where are they?" Claire said. Reeves spoke for the first time since the suturing started. "I don't know if they survived the crash. My team was supposed to have a secondary carrier. He paused. We haven't made contact. Which means either the secondary carrier is injured somewhere in this building, Claire said slowly, or they were on the train and didn't make it, or someone got to them first, Delacroix finished. The monitors in the room ran their quiet, persistent background commentary. From somewhere in the building, muffled by walls and distance, someone was calling for a crash cart. Claire looked at the door, at the glass covered by the privacy curtain, at the space between where she was and the rest of the hospital. How many of your people are in the building? She said. 4 outside, 2 doing a quiet sweep of the incoming patients. Delacroix hesitated. It's a limited presence. We're trying not to create panic, I know. She was already thinking. The specific kind of thinking that looked from the outside like nothing at all. Still face, still hands, but something behind the eyes that was moving very fast. The secondary carrier. Do you have a description? Delacroix pulled a small device from his jacket, showed her a photo. A man, mid-30s, sandy hair, athletic build, a civilian face that wasn't memorable, which was the point. Claire looked at it for 3 seconds. Bay 11, she said. Delacroix looked up. Sandy hair, mid-30s, came in with the second wave. Leg injury, field tourniquet. He was coherent, but not... She stopped. He wasn't asking the right questions. Patients who are scared about their injury ask about their injury. He was looking at the door. Delacroix was already moving toward the door to relay to the team outside. Carefully, Claire said. He's in a shared bay and we have civilians on either side of him. Understood. He stopped at the door. Captain, I'm not Captain anything right now, Delacroix. I'm a temp nurse in a trauma center. She looked at him steadily. But I'll help you find your man. Nah, getting from Bay 9 to Bay 11 without attracting attention required navigating a hospital that, at 12:41 in the morning, was running on elevated alert and had a significant military presence that half the staff had noticed, and none of them had been briefed on. Claire moved through it with the specific posture of someone with somewhere to be and no interest in explaining where, which was a posture that worked in most institutions because everyone was too busy to interrogate confidence. She went through Bay 11's curtain without breaking stride. The man with the sandy hair, the real name she didn't know, the operational name she hadn't been given, was lying in a standard gurney, leg elevated, the field tourniquet replaced with a proper clinical wrap. He was looking at the ceiling in the particular way of someone deliberately not looking at anything. His hands were resting on the bed rail. One of them had a white-knuckle quality that the rest of his body was working hard to contradict. The nurse managing his bay was a young woman named Terry, who was juggling 2 other patients in adjacent bays and had been in every 12 minutes for a check. She wasn't there right now. Claire pulled the curtain closed behind her. The man's eyes moved to her. They were careful eyes. They ran over her face, her badge, her bag, and settled on a point just behind her left shoulder in the way of someone calibrating whether there was anyone coming in after her. There isn't, she said. It's just me. A pause. Who are you? Medical staff. I'm also the person Delacroix sent. She moved to the bedside, glanced at the leg out of professional reflex, then looked at him directly. Are you the secondary? A longer pause. The math he was doing behind his eyes was visible, just barely. The documents? She said quietly. Did they make it? He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then, very slowly, he shifted his left hand off the bed rail. There was something tucked beneath his left forearm, between the arm and the rail. Flat, compact, wrapped in what looked like medical supply material, but wasn't. She recognized the wrapping. She'd seen it in the field. Water-resistant, static-shielded, the kind of packaging used for small electronic storage media in environments where the weather was trying to destroy them. The tourniquet guy at the scene wrapped it in with the bandages when he realized I couldn't make the primary, the man said. His voice was barely above a breath. I've been lying on it for 2 hours. Okay? She kept her voice level. I need to get it to Delacroix's people. Can you give it to me without making it visible to anyone walking by? If you get on the other side of me and block the curtain gap... She moved. He moved his arm. The handoff lasted maybe 4 seconds and happened entirely within the space between two bodies and a bed rail. She slid the package into her field bag without looking at it. "Are you injured?" she said. "Genuinely." "The leg's real." He said it with the flat pragmatism of someone for whom the distinction between real and operational injury was a familiar taxonomy. "Cracked fibula, they think. I'll live." "Good." She started toward the curtain. "Vasquez," he said. She stopped. "The name on some of those documents," he said. "It's not going to be easy to read." She stood with her back to him for a moment. The monitors beeped their indifferent rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was laughing, a tired, slightly hysterical laugh, the kind that happened in ERs at 1 in the morning when the worst of the crisis had passed and the nerves were finally releasing. "I've been reading hard things for a long time," she said. She went through the curtain. The walk back to Bay 9 was 40 feet and felt longer. She made it in 30 seconds and slipped through the door to find Delacroix on a low-frequency radio and Reeves sitting upright now, testing the wrap on his ribs with careful experimental breaths. She put the package on the table. Delacroix looked at it, then at her. Something moved across his face, relief mostly, with a complicated undercoat. "How did you—" he started. "Bay 11. He's stable. You should get someone to officially log him as a patient so Terry doesn't wonder why he knows more than a civilian would." She sat down for the first time since 11 o'clock. Her legs were fine. She wasn't feeling it yet, not physically. It would come later. "How much of what's in there is actionable tonight?" Delacroix was already handling the package carefully, not opening it, not here. "That's above my clearance to say." "But above mine." He looked at her. "You're technically still in the system, Captain." "Oh, stop calling me that. It's factually accurate. Tonight it's a complication I don't need." She looked at the door. "Holt is going to push for information about this bay. He's that kind of man, not because he has something to hide, but because he doesn't accept not knowing things in his own department." "Is he going to be a problem?" She thought about Holt, the pressed white coat, the form he'd been holding like evidence when he saw her badge, the way he'd said general nursing placement. "He's going to be a bureaucratic problem," she said. "Whether he's any other kind of problem, I don't know yet." Delacroix was quiet for a moment. "The documents. If what we think is in there, it's not just a paper trail. It implicates people who are still in positions, some of them in institutions that interface with this hospital." "How closely?" Claire said. "That's what we don't know yet." He looked at Reeves. That's why Reeves was on that train. Reeves had been listening to all of this with his arms folded over his wrapped ribs, carefully, accounting for the pain. "The audit started because of statistical anomalies in supply billing," he said. "Medical equipment procurement, drugs, patient outcome data during a specific contracting window. The trail kept doubling back to a cluster of facilities." He paused. "Harlow General is in the cluster." The room was very quiet. Claire didn't say anything immediately. She was doing that still face thing again. The moving fast behind the eyes thing. Putting together a shape from pieces that had been separately unremarkable. "What kind of anomalies?" she said. "The kind where someone inflated supply costs, redirected procurement funds, and buried the discrepancy in outcome reporting from the forward operations the supplies were supposed to be supporting." Reeves's voice had gone careful in a different way now. The careful of someone who understood the weight of what they were saying and was choosing not to perform it. Soldiers who were supposed to have equipment that wasn't there. Medical outcomes that were reported as procedural when they were actually supply failures. He looked at her steadily. "Your unit's operation, the one that went wrong. The one they blamed on us," she didn't say. "Someone in this hospital," she said instead. "Someone who was in this hospital during the contracting period. Whether they're still here, we're running that tonight," Delacroix said. "But we needed the documents to open the formal phase. Without them, we had inference and we had pattern, and we didn't have names." Claire looked at the package on the table. Then she looked at the door. Then she stood up and went to it, opened it just enough to look at the corridor. Holt was at the far end of the hall. He was talking to someone. She couldn't see who from this angle. and his body language was the specific configuration of a man doing two things simultaneously, conducting a conversation and watching a door. He was watching Bay 9's door. She pulled back inside and closed it. "Delacroix," she said. "Who's the senior investigative officer on this?" "Above you." "Colonel Marcus Pratt. He's not on site." "Can you get him on site?" "I can make the call." He was watching her face. "Why?" "Because I think we may be running out of time before this goes from a medical situation to a security one, and I'd rather have the full authority in the building before someone starts asking questions we're not ready to answer." She looked at the door again. "And because Holt just spent 90 seconds watching this bay from the end of the corridor, and he's the kind of man who moves when he decides he's waited long enough." Delacroix pulled out his radio. Reeves said, "Vasquez." She looked at him. "You should know." He hesitated. The first real hesitation she'd seen from him. "One of the documents. It's a communication log. Internal. Between the facility administrator and a defense procurement officer." He held her gaze. "It's dated 3 weeks before Harlan Point." She stood very still. "They knew," she said. Not a question. "The document suggests someone in this facility knew there were supply gaps in the forward theater before the operation launched." He said it cleanly, without decoration, because some things didn't need it, and that they proceeded with the billing cycle anyway. 3 weeks before Harlan Point. 3 weeks before the mission that went wrong. The mission where 4 members of her unit had operated without equipment they were supposed to have. The mission that got buried in a report that named procedural error as the cause and had her name in the margin as the responsible medical officer. The mission that had taken 4 years of her life in a different way than the combat had. "Get Pratt on the phone," she said. Her voice was the same. It was always the same. "Now." Delacroix was already dialing, and across the room Reeves was watching her with the look of someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry a thing for a long time and then be in the room where it started to unravel. And who knew that the unraveling was not clean, was not easy, and had not, despite everything, actually started yet. The door to Bay 9 opened, not from the inside. Dr. Marcus Holt stepped through, and he had his administrator face on, the one that was supposed to read as composed authority and was reading, tonight, as something considerably more pressured underneath. He looked at Delacroix, at the radio, at Reeves on the table, at Claire standing between them. His eyes went to the package on the table. Just for a second. The blink of a man who's seen something he didn't expect and whose face gives him away by trying not to. He looked away from it too quickly. "I need to know what's happening in my ER," he said. "A patient is being treated," Claire said. "You can see that. The military presence in my department is an operational matter that will be explained through the appropriate channels," Delacroix said. He'd put the radio down. His voice had the quality of someone who had said versions of this sentence before and was comfortable saying it in any room. "Dr. Holt, we appreciate your patience." "I'm not—" Holt stopped. His jaw worked. He looked at Claire again, and whatever he'd expected to see there, deference, discomfort, the look of someone who knew they were temporarily somewhere they didn't belong, he wasn't getting it. "This is still my department." "It is," Claire said, "and there are patients in it who need attention. Mrs. Kaminsky in post-op needs a night check. Bay 4's monitor has been alarming intermittently since 11:30, and someone flagged it as a calibration issue, but I'm not sure that's right. And Jamie in Bay 7 just came back from imaging." She held his gaze. "Your department needs you in it, Dr. Holt. Not in this room." It was a dismissal, delivered with complete courtesy and absolute firmness, and in a tone that made it clear she understood exactly what she was doing and had decided to do it anyway. The silence was maybe 5 seconds. Then Holt took a single step backward through the door. He didn't say anything else. He pulled the door closed behind him. Delacroix exhaled. Claire turned back to the room. "Make the call," she said. Delacroix pressed dial. While he waited for the connect, Reeves said quietly, "He looked at the table." "I know," Claire said. "Specifically at, I know. That means, it means either he recognized what he was seeing," she said, "or he recognized that he shouldn't recognize it and gave himself away doing it." She looked at the door. "Either way, it means we don't have as much time as I thought." From beyond the door, the hospital continued its night. Monitors, voices, the wheeled percussion of gurneys on linoleum, the building doing what it did, full of people doing what they could, with no idea that in a converted trauma bay in the East Wing, something had just shifted in a way that was going to change the shape of everything by morning. Delacroix said, "Colonel Pratt, we have a situation." And then Claire heard it. From somewhere in the building, not close, the sound of a door slamming. Hard. The kind of slam that wasn't accident or frustration, but the sound of someone moving fast in a direction they'd decided on. She was at the door before she'd consciously decided to move. The corridor was clear, empty except for a passing orderly. She looked toward the end of the hall. The nurse's station. The exit past it. Holt was gone. She moved fast, but not at a run. Running in a hospital at 1 a.m, got noticed, got stopped, got explained. She moved at the particular pace of someone with somewhere urgent to be and a reason not to announce it, and she went through the department the way water moved through a system it knew, finding the path of least resistance. The nurse's station was manned by a single overnight admin who was on the phone and didn't look up. The exit beyond it, the one that led to the administrative corridor, had a badge reader on the magnetic lock. Holt's badge would have opened it in under a second. She put her hand on the door, pushed, still on the swing. The air on the other side hadn't settled yet. He was maybe 40 seconds ahead of her. She went through. The administrative corridor was different from the clinical floors. Quieter, harder surfaces. The specific silence of a building's back infrastructure. Offices. Record storage. At the end, a T-junction, left toward the executive wing, right toward the facility's server room and the records archive that nobody talked about being as large as it was. She stopped at the junction and listened. Left. A sound like a desk drawer closing. Hard. She went left. Holt's office was the third door, and the light was on under it, visible as a thin line in the dark corridor, brighter than it should have been for a room where someone was trying not to be noticed. She heard him before she opened the door. Not words, just the specific acoustic signature of someone moving fast through a space and not being careful about what they knocked over doing it. She opened the door. He was at his desk, both hands on it, one on a keyboard, one on the mouse, and the screen was up, and he was moving through something with the rapid imprecision of someone in a hurry doing a task that required precision. When the door opened, he turned, and the look on his face crossed through 3 expressions in under a second. Surprise, something darker than irritation, and then the administrative recovery. The composed authority reinstating itself over whatever was underneath. But the underneath had been there. She'd seen it. "This is my office," he said. "I know." She stayed in the doorway, looked at the screen without making it obvious she was looking at the screen. He angled slightly to block it, which told her everything. "Dr. Holt, I need you to step away from the computer." The sentence sat in the room. "I beg your... The federal investigators in Bay 9 Espatier are going to want access to this terminal within the next 20 minutes, she said. "If you've added, deleted, or moved anything in the last 4 minutes, that's a different problem than the one you already have. So I need you to step away from the computer." The recovery on his face completed itself into something colder and more deliberate. "You're a temporary agency nurse," he said. "You have no authority in this room or this building to tell me anything." "That's partially true," she said. "Entirely true. The authority to tell you to step away from the computer isn't mine. It's Colonel Pratt's. I'm just the person currently standing in your doorway." She kept her voice level, not calm exactly, but controlled. The difference mattered. Calm was easy. Controlled was what you were when calm was a lie. "He'll be here in..." She checked her watch. 11 minutes. The question is whether you use those 11 minutes well or badly." Holt looked at her. The cold thing on his face had stabilized into something she'd seen before. Not guilt, not yet, but the expression of a man standing at the edge of a decision and not yet ready to admit which side he was on. "I don't know what you think you know," he said. "I know that when you walked into Bay 9, you looked at the package on the table and then immediately looked away from it. I know that most people in that room had no idea what that package was." She paused. "You did." A silence, the kind that wasn't empty. I've been managing defense contract compliance in this facility for 6 years, he said carefully. I've seen federal documentation in various forms. Recognizing a secure transport package doesn't mean anything by itself, she agreed. You're right. But you came back to this office and started moving files in the 2 minutes since you left that room, and that does mean something. She looked at him. Step away from the computer. He didn't move. Then from the corridor behind her, footsteps. 2 of Delacroix's people. She'd heard them at the junction, recognized the cadence. They came up behind her and stopped at the doorway, and Holt's eyes went to them, and the calculation on his face finally completed itself into something that looked for just a moment like a man understanding that the math he'd been doing for a long time had just come out wrong. He stepped back from the desk. One of the tactical personnel entered the room and positioned in front of the terminal. The other stayed at the door. Nobody touched anything. Pratt's jurisdiction. That was the line, and everyone in the room understood it. Holt was standing in the middle of his office with his arms at his sides, and he had the look of a man who had spent years arranging a room around himself and was now noticing for the first time that none of the furniture was actually his. Claire watched him for a moment. She looked at the man she'd watched dismiss every person who didn't fit his taxonomy of important. The residents who deferred too slowly, the nurses who didn't perform, the agency temp with the wrong bag and the wrong badge and the wrong kind of quiet. She'd seen him 3 hours ago holding a form like a weapon, and now he was standing in his own office like a man who'd forgotten how rooms worked. She didn't feel satisfied. She'd expected to feel something, some version of completion, the circuit closing. What she felt instead was tired, and underneath the tired, something older, the specific weight of being right about a thing you'd hoped you were wrong about. "Dr. Holt," she said, "is there anything you want to say before Colonel Pratt arrives?" He looked at her for a long moment. "You don't know what was at stake," he said, and something in the voice had shifted. Not a defense, not really. More like a man who had been holding a private argument for a long time and was finally saying it out loud. The contracts, the operational structure, there were pressures, institutional pressures, things that get set in motion and don't... He stopped. "You were just the nurse on the ground. You didn't see the whole picture." "I saw my unit," she said quietly. "I saw what they didn't have and what happened because of it." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I was the nurse on the ground. You're right about that. I held the line with what I had, and then someone in a comfortable chair decided that the equipment gap would just be a procedural footnote." She paused. "And then it had my name in the margin." He didn't say anything. "You had 4 years to correct that," she said. "You didn't." The corridor behind her filled with new sound, additional footsteps, purposeful and multiple. Colonel Pratt wasn't a large man in person, which always surprised people who'd only met his voice on a call. He was 50-ish, compact, with gray at the temples, and an economy of movement that suggested someone who'd stopped wasting energy on performance long ago. He came up the corridor with 2 personnel flanking him, and his eyes went to the terminal, then to Holt, then to Claire. He looked at her the way Delacroix had looked at her in the ambulance bay, but quieter. Pratt had fewer sharp edges, or rather, he kept them internal. "Captain Vasquez," he said. "I'm not," she started. "Technically you are," he said. "We can have that argument later." He stepped past her into the office. "Dr. Holt, my name is Colonel Marcus Pratt. I'm the Senior Federal Investigative Officer on this action. I need you to remain in this room." Holt looked at the terminal, where one of the tactical personnel had positioned a portable forensic device along the keyboard cable. "I want to call my attorney," he said. "That's your right," Pratt said. "You can do that from here." He turned to Claire. "Delacroix says you secured the transport package. It's in Bay 9. "Good." He paused. "I've been briefed on what Reeves told you, the communication log." He looked at her steadily. "You should know that we believe there are 3 additional documents in that package that intersect with your unit's operations. You have the right to decline to be present when they're reviewed." She looked at him. "Or," he said, "given that your clearance is active and your involvement tonight has already crossed that threshold, you can be in the room." The fluorescent light in Holt's office ran its neutral, uninterested hum. Somewhere in the clinical department, a monitor alarmed and stopped. The building breathed. "I'll be in the room," she said. Pratt nodded once. "Then let's go." She turned to follow him. Behind her, Holt said, "Vasquez." She stopped but didn't turn around. "Whatever they told you I did," he said. His voice had lost the administrative quality entirely. It was just a voice now, older, quieter, not asking for anything exactly. "I didn't think anyone would actually be there." She stood still for a moment. "That," she said, "was the problem." She walked out of the office, and behind her she heard the door close, and the sound of a man sitting down heavily in a chair in a room that had just finished being his. In Bay 9, the package was open. Pratt's forensic specialist had it on the table with 2 devices running, and Reeves was upright on the gurney watching, and Delacroix was near the door with his arms folded and the look of someone who is finally, after a long time, standing in the right room. Claire stood at the edge of the table and looked at the document spreading across its surface. Some digital, some printed copies of things that had been digitized from older paper originals, some with header markings she recognized from the contracting period, and some she didn't. And there, near the bottom of the stack, printed on paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times to leave white creases in the margins, was a communication log dated 3 weeks before Harlan Point. She looked at the header, at the sender, at the recipient, and the name on the recipient line wasn't Holt's. Pratt was watching her face. "Vasquez." "This wasn't just Holt," she said. "No," Pratt said. "It wasn't." She looked at the second name, someone she hadn't been in the same room with tonight, someone who wasn't in this building, someone who, as of 11:53 that evening, was still listed in the federal contractor database as an active consultant to 3 defense-adjacent medical facilities in Ohio. "Where are they right now?" she said. Pratt's expression shifted, just slightly. The kind of shift that meant the answer was complicated. "That's what we've been trying to determine," he said carefully, "for the last 40 minutes. The room went very still. "Are you telling me," Claire said slowly, "that the second name on this document is currently unaccounted for?" Pratt said nothing, which was, again, an answer. And from the corridor outside Bay 9, Delacroix's radio crackled. Not voice, just static, the particular broken pattern of a channel trying to connect from somewhere close, from somewhere inside the building. Delacroix pulled the radio off his belt and keyed it twice. The check signal, the one that asked, "Are you there?" without saying anything that could be heard wrong. The response came back broken, fragmented, the kind of interference that happened when someone was transmitting from inside a building with reinforced walls, or when someone was deliberately masking their position. "Which channel?" Claire said. "Secondary tactical. It's not one of ours." Delacroix was already reconfiguring the frequency dial. "Someone's broadcasting on an adjacent band, close enough to bleed over." "How close?" He listened for 3 seconds. "Same floor." Claire was at the door before the word finished. She looked out into the corridor. Empty. The usual overnight skeleton of Harlow General's East Wing, the fluorescent lights running their tireless performance for nobody in particular. But she was listening now, the way she'd learned to listen in places where listening was the difference between 2 kinds of outcome, and the building had a sound that wasn't right. A door, distant, not closing, opening, the specific exhalation of a pressurized fire door releasing. Stairwell, East End. "Pratt," she said, not turning from the corridor. "The second name on that document. Give it to me." A pause behind her. Pratt deciding how much operational protocol mattered in the next 60 seconds. He decided correctly. "Garrison. Victor Garrison. He's listed as an independent compliance consultant. His last contracted facility interface was 18 months ago, but his building access credentials were flagged as still active in the Harlow system." Flagged as active or confirmed revoked? Flagged as active. "So he can walk through any door in this building," Claire said. "Theoretically." She turned back to Pratt. "Then he's not unaccounted for." "He's here." She looked at Delacroix. "The stairwell at the east end goes up to the administrative floor and down to the basement. Medical records, server infrastructure, physical document archive." She paused. "If the documents in that package are the copies Reeves transported, There are originals somewhere. Physical originals from the contracting period that were never fully digitized. Pratt straightened. The archive. If Garrison has been tracking this investigation, and if he had any forewarning tonight was going sideways, he'd know the physical records are the confirmation layer. Everything else is reconstructible, deniable, arguable. The paper originals aren't. She was already moving. He's not running. He's cleaning. Pratt had his radio up. Delacroix was 2 steps behind her and already gesturing to his personnel in the corridor. The stairwell door at the east end weighed more than it looked. She hit it hard and took the stairs at a controlled descent. Not reckless, not slow. The cadence of someone who understood that arriving injured was worse than arriving 30 seconds later. Delacroix came down behind her. One of his people stayed at the top to hold the position. The basement corridor was a different world from the floors above. Older infrastructure, lower ceilings. The smell of the building's mechanical guts mixed with the dry paper smell of decades of stored documentation. The lighting was motion-activated and had the sluggish reaction time of systems that weren't maintained for speed, which meant that the lights 40 feet ahead were already on. Someone had walked through there recently enough that they hadn't timed out yet. Claire moved along the wall rather than the center of the corridor. Not dramatic, just practical, keeping herself out of the obvious sightline of anyone who might look back from the far end. She could hear something now. Not footsteps. A sound she recognized and didn't like. The specific rhythmic percussion of physical files being moved in volume. Drawers. Metal filing drawers, the old lateral kind that took both hands and made noise no matter how carefully you tried. He wasn't being careful. He was being fast. The archive room had a code-locked door that was standing open when she reached it. Garrison's credentials had opened it, and he hadn't bothered to let it close behind him. Inside, the room was large enough that she couldn't see all of it from the entrance. Industrial shelving in rows, color-coded binders going back decades, the lateral file cabinets along the far wall, and there, at the third cabinet from the right, a man in his late 50s with his back to her and both arms moving with the focused urgency of someone who had calculated the time he had and was working inside it. Victor Garrison was not what she'd expected, which she recognized as a failure of expectation rather than his doing. She'd built an image from a name on a document, and images built that way were never accurate. He was heavy-set, silver-haired, in a good jacket that had been good enough for an evening that wasn't supposed to end in a hospital basement. He had the bearing of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where he was the person with context that others lacked. The specific posture of institutional authority, the kind that didn't require a title to project. He heard her. He turned. For a half-second, he ran the same assessment she'd just run. Quick, professional, the evaluation of a man who'd spent years in environments where reading a room meant reading the people in it first. He looked at her badge. The temporary marker, the worn fleece, the bag. And he did the same thing Holt had done 3 hours ago, which was to file her into the category of not the primary problem. Buildings restricted to authorized personnel, he said. His voice was even, practiced. You need to clear this area. The filing cabinet, she said. Step away from it. His eyes sharpened. The reassessment happening in real time. Who are you? The person who's been here all night, she said. Claire Vasquez. I treated the patient in Bay 9. She watched his face. You know what was in the package he was carrying? Something shifted in his expression. Not fear. Not yet. The look of a man updating his calculation. I don't know what you're... The communication log, she said. Dated 3 weeks before Harlan Point. Your name is on it. So is Holt's. The room was very quiet, except for the ventilation system running its basement drone. Holt's in his office, she said. Federal personnel are with him right now. The package is secured. The forensic review has already started. She kept her voice flat, giving him information the way you gave someone a diagnosis, clearly, without softening it into something it wasn't. You came down here because the physical records are the one layer that isn't in the digital chain of custody yet. You need them gone. He looked at the cabinet behind him. The calculation was visible. She could almost track it. The time it would take. Whether she was alone. Whether the door behind her was clear. Don't, she said. He turned for the cabinet. Delacroix came through the door. Garrison stopped. He was good enough not to do something that would make the next 5 minutes worse than they needed to be. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the tactical personnel entering the room, and the expression on his face completed its journey through the various stages of a man recognizing that the geometry of a situation has closed around him. "Victor Garrison," Delacroix said, "I need you to move away from the filing equipment." Garrison moved, not willingly, but deliberately, the way people moved when they decided that compliance was the better tactical position. He stepped back until the cabinet was behind him, and Delacroix's people were in front of him, and he stood there with the particular stillness of someone recalibrating from action to strategy. He looked at Claire. "You were the evac nurse," he said. "Harlan Point." "Yes." "I remember the report," he said, and something in the way he said it, not apologetic, not cruel, just factual, the statement of a man who had processed that report the same way he processed everything, as a document rather than an event, told her more about him than anything else he could have said. "What happened to my unit wasn't a procedural error," she said. I know what the report said." She looked at him steadily. "I'm telling you what happened." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said with the same even tone, "The contracting structure was under pressure from multiple institutional directions. The gaps were," he paused, choosing, "anticipated to be bridged by supplementary procurement. That didn't happen on the timeline it was supposed to. People got hurt because of that gap. People get hurt in forward operations," he said, "not callously, just the blunt mathematics of someone who had spent long enough in oversight roles that the distance between a decision and its human consequence had calcified into policy language." She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had been, for 4 years, a name she didn't have for the shape of what had happened. She'd carried the weight of Harlan Point the way you carried things that had no address. No place to put them down, no door to knock on. Now she was looking at the door. She didn't feel the closure she'd thought she would. What she felt was closer to something settling, not resolution, but the first movement toward it. The difference between a wound being open and a wound being found. "Secure the cabinet," she said to Delacroix. She looked at Garrison one more time. "Don't answer anything else without counsel. You know that better than I do." She walked out of the archive room and back into the corridor, and the motion-activated lights behind her began their slow countdown to off. The next hour at Harlow General ran on 2 parallel tracks that barely acknowledged each other. On the clinical floor, the mass casualty event was winding down into the long tail of emergency medicine. The part that wasn't dramatic, that was just work. Patients stabilized, transferred, discharged, admitted. Families arrived and were brought to waiting areas. Adler ran the post-surge assessment with the methodical focus of someone who would not allow herself to be anything other than functional until every patient was accounted for. Marsh found his footing somewhere around 2 in the morning and stopped second-guessing his own hands. Terry, in Bay 11, finally noticed that her patient with the sandy hair had 2 different people come in to check on him from outside the clinical staff, and filed that in the folder in her brain labeled "Ask About Later." Priya worked. She always worked. But she was tracking something, the way she'd been tracking things since the ambulance bay. The movement of information through the building the way you tracked a current beneath surface water, feeling it without seeing it directly. She saw the federal personnel in the administrative corridor at 2:15. She saw Holt's office lights stay on past 3. She saw Claire come back up from the basement and go directly to Bay 9 without speaking to anyone on the floor. And she watched the way Claire moved, not faster or slower than before, but with something different. Something completed in the carriage of her shoulders. At 2:40, Pratt came to the nurse's station. He wasn't in tactical gear. He'd never been. It wasn't that kind of operation. But he had the bearing that made people organize themselves slightly when he approached. The unconscious social gravity of someone accustomed to rooms paying attention to him. "I need to make a statement to your department administration," he said to Priya. "Is there a facility administrator available?" "Dr. Holt is the—" She stopped. "Yes," Pratt said. "I'll need the backup administrative contact." Priya called the deputy administrator, a man named Ferris who was reached at home and arrived 40 minutes later in the wrong shoes and an expression of controlled alarm. Pratt walked him through the basics in Ferris's own temporary office, Not everything, not the documentation specifics, but enough. The investigation, the individuals involved, the immediate operational requirements for the facility. Ferris was not a dramatic man. He listened, asked 3 precise questions, and then sat back in his chair and said, "How long has this been running?" "The investigation formally, 14 months, Pratt said. The underlying conduct, we believe, closer to 9 years. Ferris looked at the ceiling for a moment. The specific look of a man doing the arithmetic of institutional damage and arriving at a number he doesn't want to say out loud. "What do you need from the facility?" he said. "Cooperative access to records and systems. A communication freeze on administrative personnel until we complete the initial review phase. And..." Pratt paused. "The temporary nursing staff member who was placed here tonight, Vasquez. I need her status extended through the review period under a modified authorization." Ferris looked at him. "Extended. She's a material witness to events this evening and a relevant party to the underlying investigation. We'd like her available." "She's agency staff. I can handle the authorization through federal channels," Pratt said. "I just need the facility not to push back." Ferris looked at his desk for a moment. "She's the one who kept this department running tonight, isn't she?" he said. Not a question exactly. Pratt said nothing. "I had 3 nurses come to the desk between midnight and 2, asking where she was," Ferris said. "That's in a mass casualty event. That doesn't happen with agency staff." He looked up. "I'll make the call." By 3:30, Holt had been formally escorted to a federal administrative holding facility. Not arrested, not yet, but removed from the building under the kind of cooperative custody that meant his attorney had been called and his access credentials had been suspended, and the word voluntary was being used in the specific way it was used when people understood the alternative. He went quietly. That surprised some of the staff who'd heard the rumors spreading in low voices through the overnight shift. They'd expected something louder from a man who'd run a department through sheer force of personality for 6 years. He didn't look at anyone on the way out. Not Adler, who was standing near the nurse's station with her tablet and the expression of someone processing several things simultaneously. Not Marsh, who'd heard about it from Brandon, who'd heard it from someone in administration. The information moving through the building the way information always moved. Faster than anyone intended and less accurate than anyone wanted. Not Priya. But he stopped once. At the end of the main corridor, just before the exit to the ambulance bay, he stopped and turned. Claire was 20 feet away at the supply station near Bay 3, restocking something that had been depleted during the surge. She was doing it the way she did everything, with the focused attention of someone for whom the task at hand was the task at hand, regardless of what else was in the room. Holt looked at her for a moment. She didn't look up. He walked out. Garrison's situation was less orderly. He'd retained the cooperation posture until Delacroix's team finished the initial archive sweep, at which point, with the physical documents secured, the digital forensic process running on the administrative terminals, and his own communication records being pulled through federal channels, he requested counsel and stopped speaking. That was his right, and everyone respected it, and it changed exactly nothing about the shape of what was in those filing cabinets. The communication log, the billing cycle documents, the procurement records with the handwritten annotations that someone had been careful about and not careful enough. The internal memos from the contracting period that used the kind of language people used when they were certain they were only talking to each other. Shorthand, assumption, the vocabulary of a closed system that didn't know it was being read. Pratt reviewed them in Bay 9 with 2 specialists and a forensic accountant who'd arrived at 3 a.m. and set up a laptop on the procedure tray with the calm of someone conducting a spreadsheet review in the most normal environment imaginable. Reeves, still on the gurney, had been offered a transfer to a more comfortable setting twice and declined twice. He was watching the process the way someone watched something they'd been trying to bring to completion for a long time, and he wasn't going to leave the room where it was happening. Claire came in at 3:55. She'd finished the department work, or finished enough of it, the part that needed her specifically. She'd handed the rest to Priya with a quiet and complete briefing, patient by patient, the kind of handoff that communicated in its thoroughness exactly how much had been held together through the night. Priya had taken it without comment, which was the right response. She sat in the chair against the wall of Bay 9. Not the table. She wasn't part of the forensic process. Not directly. She'd been in this room enough tonight. But Pratt had told her she could stay, and she was staying. She looked tired. Not the performed tiredness that people displayed to get sympathy, but the actual physiological kind. The lines around her eyes that weren't usually there. The slight forward curve in the posture of someone whose body was presenting a bill for the last 8 hours. She looked like a person who had done a large thing and wasn't being careful about hiding the cost. Pratt set a document on the table in front of her. She looked at it. It was a personnel record. Her own. The military version, not the agency file. The real one, pulled from the classified archive layer that her administrative separation had been filed above. She recognized her own name in the header, and below it, the operational record from the contracting period and the events of Harlan Point laid out in the flat language of official documentation. The original classification on your unit's incident report, Pratt said, was filed under a code that attributed the supply failure to field command error. Your name is listed as the responsible medical officer. I know, she said. The reclassification will remove that attribution and reattach it to the procurement failure chain, which traces back to Garrison's certification of supply adequacy in the contracting period. He paused. It's not a quick process. There are layers of review, archive procedure, but the basis for it is in that cabinet. She looked at her name on the document. She'd looked at versions of this document before, the redacted copies she'd been allowed to see, the ones with the black bars where the context should have been. This one had no black bars. It was just the record, the way the record actually was, and reading it was a specific kind of strange, like seeing a photograph of an accident you'd been in, taken from an angle you couldn't have occupied at the time. How long, she said. For full reclassification, 4 to 6 months. The criminal proceedings will run separately, but that timeline depends on the prosecutor's office. He looked at her steadily. But the internal record correction, your service file, we can initiate that before this week is out. She nodded. Not with relief exactly. With the specific acknowledgement of someone who'd learned not to feel things fully until they were actually final, because unfinal things had a way of reverting. There's one more thing, Pratt said. She waited. He set a second document beside the first. This one she didn't recognize immediately. It was a personnel action form, the kind used for active duty status review. Her name was in the header again, but the field below it was different from the last time she'd seen a form like this. Your status was never fully resolved, he said carefully. The classification above your separation paperwork has your service flagged as administratively incomplete, which technically means, you told me this earlier, she said, through Delacroix. I told you part of it. The part I didn't tell you is that an administratively incomplete separation can be resolved 2 ways, he paused. It can be finalized as a discharge, effective retroactively. Or, he stopped. She looked at him. Or the circumstances of the incomplete separation can be reviewed in light of new documentation and reclassified as an active duty continuity, in which case the 4 years you've been out. He stopped again, choosing the next words carefully. They would be logged differently. The room was very quiet. You're not asking me to re-enlist, she said slowly. No, this isn't about the future. It's about how the record characterizes what's already happened. He looked at her. It's your choice. Both resolutions close the administrative gap. One of them also changes what the record says about where you were and what you were doing during the period of the contracting investigation. She sat with that for a moment. If the record shows active duty continuity, she said, then my presence here tonight would be logged differently than a temporary civilian agency placement. Yes. She looked at the form, at her name, at the blank field below the header. She was 32 years old and she'd spent 4 years trying to build a life that fit inside the shape of someone who had simply moved on. And the truth was that it had never quite fit right, the way clothes fit wrong when they're designed for a different body. She'd been good at her work. She'd been good at her work everywhere she'd done it, but she'd been doing it in borrowed clothes. I need to think about it, she said. You have time, Pratt said. She put both documents face down on the table beside her, and she looked at the wall for a moment, and nobody in the room said anything, because everyone present understood that some moments required the specific courtesy of silence. At 4:20 in this morning, the overnight shift at Harlow General was in the particular phase that nurses called the long stretch. Not quiet, never fully quiet, but the sustained low-pressure interval between the previous crisis and whatever the next one would be. Patients were doing the slow work of being patients. Monitors ran their reliable commentary. Somewhere in the building, someone was heating something in a break room microwave, and the smell was traveling farther than it should have. Adler found Claire at the supply station again. She was doing what she'd been doing intermittently for the past hour, finding work, filling gaps, moving through the department the way she'd moved through everything tonight, with the self-contained efficiency of someone who needed to be useful the way other people needed to be still. "You should sit down," Adler said. "I'm fine." "I know you are. I'm saying it anyway." Adler leaned against the station and looked at her with the particular directness of someone who was too tired for anything except being honest. "You held this department together tonight." Claire didn't respond immediately. She finished marking a supply count and put the clipboard back in its bracket. "The department held itself together," she said. "I just filled in the gaps where things were going sideways." "That's what holding something together is," Adler said. A pause. "Holt's gone," Claire said. "I know." "You knew something was off with him." Adler looked at the corridor. "I knew something was off. I didn't know what. You spend enough time in a building with someone, you learn the shape of their blind spots." She paused. His blind spot was that he thought presence and authority were the same thing. A lot of people think that. Most of them aren't running trauma centers. Adler looked back at her. "The federal people, what happens next?" "To the department. Ferris is acting administrator. Pratt's team will do their review. The clinical operations are independent of the investigation. That's protected." She paused. "The department is fine. Your staff did good work tonight." "Our staff," Adler said. Claire looked at her. "You were on the floor for 6 hours," Adler said, "in a mass casualty event. You triaged, you treated, you managed a secondary situation that I now understand was considerably more complicated than I was aware of." She looked at Claire steadily. "Whatever your badge says, you were part of this staff tonight. Don't correct me on that." Claire didn't correct her. At 5:10, Priya found her sitting in the corridor outside Bay 9, back against the wall, legs extended, field bag across her lap. It was the most informal position anyone had seen her take all night, and something about it, the small humanness of a person finally letting gravity have a word, stopped Priya in the corridor for a moment before she sat down next to her. They were quiet for a bit. The corridor was empty in both directions. The lights ran their overnight frequency, slightly dimmer than the daytime setting. "The paperwork you flagged on Mrs. Kaminsky," Priya said finally. "The warfarin. Ortho said she's stable. The post-op is clean." She paused. "She asked about you." "Is she—" "She's fine. She just wanted to know if the nurse with the old bag was still there." Priya looked at her. "I told her yes." Claire looked at the bag in her lap. The worn strap, the scuffed corners, the specific patina of something that had been in more places than it looked. She'd bought it before deployment. She'd carried it through environments where the bag was the only constant, where everything else changed, the people, the terrain, the nature of what was required. And the bag was just the bag, reliable in the specific way of objects that didn't have the option of failing. "Priya," she said. "Yeah. When I told you tonight was going to get complicated, before any of it started. I remember. You said you'd stay close." Claire looked at the corridor. "Thank you for that." Priya was quiet for a moment. "You said to trust what you were doing, not what was being said about it." She paused. "I figured anyone who made that distinction was worth staying close to." From the far end of the corridor, footsteps. One of Pratt's forensic specialists, young, serious, moving with the direction of someone who knew exactly where they were going. She stopped in front of Bay 9, looked at a tablet, knocked once on the door, and went inside. Claire watched her go. "The investigation," Priya said. "How deep does it go?" "Deeper than Holt," Claire said. "Garrison. Possibly others we don't have names for yet." She paused. The billing irregularities go back 9 years. Defense contracts, supply chain, the kind of thing that looks like paperwork until you understand what the paperwork was covering. Which was people not having what they needed, Claire said, when they needed it. Priya absorbed that. She was too experienced at the receiving end of insufficient resources to ask the follow-up question. She understood it without the follow-up. Is it going to touch the hospital? She said. The department. The investigation will. The liability. I don't know yet. That's not my area. But Holt made decisions, Claire said. Other people made decisions above him. The institutional fallout. That's for the lawyers and the federal process. She looked at Priya. What the department does from here is what the department does. That part's yours. Priya looked at her. Adler's the senior attending. I know. She's going to end up running this department. I know that too. She's going to need good people around her. Priya said it like a statement, not a question, and with the particular tone of someone leaving a door open without pointing at it. Claire looked at the bag in her lap. At 5:47 in the morning, with the corridor still quiet and the department beginning the very first movements of the day shift's arrival, Pratt came out of Bay 9 and stood in front of them. He looked at Claire. The forensic review of the first document package is complete, he said. We have enough to open the formal proceedings. He paused. There's something you need to see. Inside. She got up. On the table in Bay 9, the forensic specialist had flagged a section of the communication log. Not the section with Garrison's name, not the section with Holt's. A different section. Below the main correspondence, in what had originally looked like a distribution notation, the standard CC line, the list of who else received the communication. The specialist pointed to it. Claire looked. There were 4 names on the distribution line. Garrison, Holt. 2 others she didn't recognize. Contractors, probably. People the investigation hadn't gotten to yet. And below the 4 names, 1 more. A name she recognized. Not because it was famous. Not because she'd been looking for it. Because she'd seen it that night. Not in a document, not on a wall, but on a badge. A badge that had been in this building, in her department, in her peripheral vision during the longest night of the last 4 years. She read it twice to be certain. Pratt, she said. I know, he said. This person was here tonight. I know, he said again, and his face had the specific quality of someone who had been holding something for the last hour and had finally found the moment to set it down. She looked up from the document. Where are they now? She said. Pratt looked at his radio, then at the door, then back at her. That, he said, is the problem. The name on the distribution line was Dr. Simone Adler. Claire stood at the table in Bay 9 and looked at it without moving for a long moment. Her mind ran backward through the night, not frantically, but with the particular precision of a brain that had been trained to reconstruct timelines under pressure. Adler at the nurse's station when Claire arrived. Adler redirecting Holt's wrong decisions. Adler managing the surge with the calm of someone who had done this before. Adler in the corridor 40 minutes ago, telling her you were part of this staff tonight. The name was there, clear, dated from 9 years ago. But something wasn't adding up, and Claire had learned. In operating rooms, in field stations, in the specific crucible of situations where the wrong conclusion killed people, that the thing that didn't add up was always the thing that mattered most. What was her role in the distribution? Claire said. Pratt looked at the specialist, who pulled up a secondary document on the tablet. The communication log shows her as a recipient, not an author. The CC line, I know what a CC line is, Claire said. Was there any response documented from her name? The specialist scrolled. Pratt watched her face. No response, the specialist said. The log shows receipt confirmation, and then she stopped. There's a flag in the metadata. The receipt was accessed once, same day, and then a deletion request was filed on the recipient's end. She looked up. Someone tried to delete the record of receiving it. Did it work? Claire said. Partially. The surface record was cleared. The metadata wasn't, that's what we're reading now. She paused. Which could mean the recipient deleted it because they were complicit and wanted no trace, Or, or they deleted it because they didn't want anyone to know they'd received it, Claire said, and they never responded because they were trying to pretend it never arrived. Pratt looked at her carefully. There's a difference, Claire said, between someone who was part of a corrupt system and someone who got pulled into a room they didn't ask to be in. She looked at the document. Garrison and Holt. Their names are in the body of the correspondence. They're the authors. Adler's name is at the bottom of a list she may not have consented to being on. That's a legal distinction that the prosecutor's office— I know whose distinction it is, Claire said. I'm asking whether you ran it before you told me her name like it was the same weight as the other two. The room was quiet. Pratt said, We don't know yet. That's the honest answer. Then don't lose her, Claire said. Don't let her leave the building before you know. But don't treat her like Garrison until you do. She looked at him. Where is she right now? Pratt was already on his radio. Quote, Adler was in her office. She was sitting at her desk with the lights on and a cold cup of coffee and the look of someone who had been sitting there for a while. Not working, not resting, just sitting, which was unusual enough for her that the overnight admin who'd passed the office twice in the last 30 minutes had made a mental note of it. When Pratt knocked and opened the door, she looked up without surprise, which was itself a kind of answer. You found it, she said. Pratt came in. Claire came in behind him. Adler looked at her. A long, careful look, the kind that was trying to read something and was having trouble deciding what it found. The distribution log, Adler said. Not a question. Yes, Pratt said. She nodded slowly. Her hands were flat on the desk, not gripping anything. I've been waiting for someone to find that for about 6 years. She said it the way people said things they'd rehearsed internally for so long that saying them out loud felt like translation rather than confession. I didn't know what was in the communication until after I opened it. By the time I understood what I was looking at, I'd already been CC'd, already been logged as a recipient. She looked at the desk. I tried to delete the record of it. That was stupid. It just made me look more involved rather than less. Why didn't you report it? Pratt said. A long pause. The real kind about, not stalling, but the pause of someone who had asked themselves this question in various forms for years and had a complicated answer. Because I didn't have anything except my own receipt, but I'm on receipt of one document, she said. And Garrison was connected to 3 board-level oversight positions in this hospital. And Holt was my department chief. She looked up, and I was a woman who'd been an attending for 4 years trying to make it to senior level without having to spend the next decade being the person who made that call and couldn't prove it. She stopped. I know how that sounds. It sounds like someone who was scared, Claire said. Adler looked at her. That's not an absolution, Claire added. People got hurt because of what those documents covered up. People had their names in the margin of a report that was protecting the people who should have been in the margin instead. She held Adler's gaze. But scared isn't the same as complicit. And the prosecutor is going to need to understand the difference, so I need you to understand it first. Adler sat with that. I kept copies, she said quietly, of everything I received. I didn't know if I'd ever use them. I kept them. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside, a sealed manila envelope, old enough that the adhesive on the flap had yellowed. I made them the week after I received the communication, before I deleted my record of it. She looked at Pratt. I think they might help. Pratt took the envelope carefully. He looked at Claire once. She looked at Adler. You're going to need a lawyer, a good one, tonight. I know. And you're going to need to tell everything, not your version. Everything, including the parts that make you look bad. Adler nodded. I know that too. She paused. Vasquez, what happened to your unit? I didn't understand the connection. Not until tonight. She stopped. I'm sorry that it took this long to surface. Claire looked at her for a moment. Get your lawyer, she said. Tell the truth. That's what you can do right now. She walked out of the office. Behind her, she heard Pratt begin the formal process. The measured language of a man who understood both what he was doing and what it cost. And she stood in the hallway outside and breathed the recycled institutional air and let herself feel, for a moment, the full and complicated weight of a night that had refused to be simple. Nothing about it was clean. Adler wasn't a villain and wasn't innocent. Holt had done damage through a combination of arrogance and deliberate blindness. Garrison had looked at human consequence and processed it as a line item. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, 4 years ago, in a forward position that didn't have the equipment it was supposed to have, her unit had made the best decisions they could with what they'd been given and been blamed for what they hadn't. She stood in the hallway and held all of it and didn't try to simplify it into something easier. By 6:15, the day shift was beginning its arrival. The specific sound of a department changing hands, the new voices, the updated briefings, the coffee that was better than what the overnight had made because someone on days had a ritual about it. The overnight staff moved in the slightly hollowed way of people at the end of a long run, finishing their handoffs with the relief of the nearly done. Word had traveled. It always traveled. In a hospital, information moved through staff the way blood moved through a body, necessary, continuous, faster under pressure. The versions varied. Some of them were accurate. Some of them had details that had been processed through 3 people's filters and come out the other side reshaped. But the general shape was understood. Something had happened last night that went beyond the train derailment. Federal personnel. Administrative removal. A name people had been deferring to for years, walking out of the building between people in tactical gear. The nurses who'd worked the surge knew more than the day staff. Brandon had told someone who'd told 2 people. Marsh had said almost nothing, which communicated volumes to anyone who knew him. Priya handled every person who came to her with the same consistent response. We'll know more through official channels, and right now the floor needs to function, so let's function. She was good at it. It was the kind of leadership that didn't announce itself, just showed up and held the shape of things when the shape was under pressure. She found Claire at the supply station one final time, at 6:37, with the day shift nurse for that area standing at a polite distance, waiting to take over. Claire was doing a final count with the specificity of someone who couldn't leave a thing partially done. You should go home, Priya said. Almost done. The day staff can... Almost done, Claire said again. Priya waited. The count finished. Claire handed the clipboard to the day shift nurse with a brief, complete summary of what had been used and what had been flagged for reorder, and the nurse took it with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving more information than they'd anticipated. Priya walked with Claire to the locker area near the main entrance. They didn't talk much on the way. There wasn't much left to say that the night hadn't already said, and both of them knew it. At the locker, Claire opened her temporary unit and took out her jacket. Her own jacket, the one she'd come in with, civilian and worn, and entirely hers. She put it on over the scrubs, picked up the field bag. What happens now? Priya said. For you. Claire considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The investigation runs its process. I'm a material witness. I'll be available for that. She paused. Pratt offered me a documentation resolution that closes the gap in my service record. I haven't decided yet. What's the decision? Whether I want the record to reflect what was true, Claire said, or whether I want to move forward without dragging the past into official shape. She looked at the bag in her hand. Both are legitimate choices. I'm just not sure which one I'm making for the right reasons. Priya looked at her for a moment. For what it's worth. And I know it's not worth much from someone who's known you for about 8 hours. It's worth something, Claire said. You spent 4 years being a person who had to carry something that wasn't yours to carry, Priya said. Whatever form the resolution takes, the carrying part should be done. That's what I'd want, for it to be done. She paused. The form is just paperwork. Claire looked at her, then she nodded, slow, not performative, the nod of someone receiving something they intended to keep. You're going to do well running this floor, Claire said. Priya blinked. I'm not. Adler's going to be navigating a legal situation for a while. Holt is gone. Ferris doesn't know clinical operations from the supply cart. She picked up the bag. The floor needs someone who knows what they're doing and doesn't need to announce it. That's you. She met Priya's eyes. You stayed close. When it mattered. Priya stood in the locker room after Claire left and looked at the middle distance for a moment, in the way of someone receiving information they already knew and were now, finally, deciding to act on. The formal proceedings unfolded over the following weeks, in the way that federal investigations unfolded, Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the implacable momentum of a process that had found its footing and wasn't going to stumble. The mechanisms were unglamorous. Documents reviewed, depositions taken, subpoenas issued to people who received them in their offices and in their homes, and in 2 cases at airports, which generated the kind of attention that people who'd spent careers being careful tried hard to avoid. Garrison was charged formally on 7 counts: procurement fraud, falsification of federal contract documentation, and conspiracy to obstruct a military investigation. His attorney argued for leniency on the grounds of institutional pressure, which was the argument of a man whose best option was a story rather than a defense. The prosecutor's office was not moved by stories. Holt cooperated, partial cooperation, with conditions. The way people cooperated when they were trying to manage the damage to a life that still had components worth protecting. His medical license was suspended pending the proceedings. The cooperation bought him a reduced exposure on the criminal side and did nothing for the civil liability, which the families of 2 soldiers who'd been injured during the supply gap period at Harlow Point had already initiated through separate counsel. Adler's situation resolved into something that didn't fit neatly into either category. She was a witness, ultimately, a significant one, with documents that became a load-bearing part of the prosecution's evidentiary structure. The manila envelope she'd kept for 6 years turned out to contain something she hadn't fully understood when she'd made the copies: a billing authorization signature that placed Garrison's knowledge of the supply gap 3 weeks earlier than the communication log suggested. It closed a timeline gap the prosecution had been working around. The legal proceedings against her personally were deferred, pending review. It was the most accurate outcome for something that had never been simple. Not exoneration, not prosecution, but the legally appropriate acknowledgement that the situation was complicated in ways that required careful handling rather than a clean verdict. She retained her license. She retained her position at Harlow General under conditions with oversight. Whether that outcome was just was a question that different people in the building answered differently, and they were all entitled to their answers. The Harlow Point reclassification took 4 months and 11 days. Claire was in Crestwood for most of it, not at Harlow General, but nearby, available for the witness deposition schedule that ran through March and into April. She'd taken a position at a community health clinic in the interim, the kind of work that was unglamorous and essential, treating patients who didn't have easy access to the system and didn't need their nurse to be impressive, just present and competent and there. She was good at it. She'd always been good at it. The letter from the military records office arrived on a Thursday morning. She was at the clinic when it came. She got the notification on her phone, the official digital confirmation, and she read it standing in the break room between a shift handoff and a patient intake, and the woman who came in behind her to get coffee. 3 minutes later, found the break room empty and the door to the back slightly open, and assumed the nurse had stepped out for air. Claire stood in the narrow alley behind the clinic for about 4 minutes. It was cold. Ohio in April still had that particular cold that couldn't decide whether it was winter leaving or spring arriving. And she stood in it without her jacket because she'd come out too fast to think about her jacket, and she looked at the sky, which was overcast and unremarkable, and she breathed. The reclassification was complete. The incident report for Harlow Point had been formally amended. The attribution of medical command error had been removed from her service record and replaced with documentation of the supply failure chain, which terminated, on paper, with Garrison's name. Her operational record for the period had been reinstated. The commendations, the field citations, the documentation of what her unit had actually done in the circumstances they'd actually been in. 4 years. She'd carried the wrong name on a report for 4 years. She didn't cry. She wasn't built for public crying, and she was in a semi-public alley. And anyway, what she was feeling wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. It was something older, deeper, the specific sensation of a thing being set down that you've carried so long you'd stop noticing the weight. You only felt it gone. She went back inside. She saw her next patient. The recognition event at Harlow General was not her idea. Ferris organized it, in consultation with Pratt's office and the hospital board, who were in the aggressive process of institutional renewal and understood that renewal required narrative as much as it required structural change. Claire was asked, not told, and she said yes after thinking about it for a week. Not because she wanted the event, but because she understood that what the event was really for wasn't her. It was for the staff who'd been in that building on the night of the derailment, the residents who'd found their footing under pressure, the nurses who'd kept running despite the chaos, the paramedics in the bay who'd reconfigured the entire intake layout in 4 minutes because someone with a battered bag had explained why it mattered. For those people, the recognition event was a chance to understand what they'd been part of. Not just a mass casualty response, but a night where something much older had finally been dragged into the light. The main conference room was full, standing room by the back wall. Priya was there, in the 3rd row, with the particular expression of someone who was proud of something and was not going to perform the pride. Marsh was there. He'd grown incrementally in the months since, in the way that young doctors grew when their assumptions got tested and they chose to learn from the testing rather than resent it. Brandon was there. Even Terry from Bay 11 was there, finally having gotten the full story about the patient with the sandy hair and the strange package under his arm, and having processed it with the practical equanimity of someone who'd decided that extraordinary things happened in hospitals and she was going to keep showing up anyway. Reeves was not there. He was in another city, doing another version of what he did, which was the nature of the work. Delacroix was there, in the back, in civilian clothes, which made him look slightly like he was wearing a costume, but he'd come, which mattered. Pratt was there. He stood near the window with his hands in his pockets and watched with the satisfied stillness of someone watching a process complete itself correctly. Ferris introduced her. He was good at it, better than she'd expected from a man she'd only seen in wrong shoes at 3 a.m, and he told the story with appropriate accuracy and without the inflation that institutional narratives usually carried. He named what had happened. He named the role she'd played. He named, carefully and with the right gravity, what the investigation had uncovered and what it meant for the people whose names had been in the wrong margins for too long. Then it was her turn. She stood at the front of the room in clothes that were not a uniform and not scrubs, just her own clothes, the kind that fit correctly, and she looked at the room full of people who'd been with her through a night that she would carry for a long time, and she understood something she hadn't fully understood before standing in front of it. She hadn't worked alone. She'd never worked alone. Not in the forward theater, not in that ambulance bay, not in the archive room in the basement where a man had been trying to burn away the evidence of what his decisions had cost. She'd been the thread that night, but threads needed fabric, and the fabric was everyone in this room who'd kept moving when the structure was failing and the plan had stopped resembling itself. She was not naturally a speaker. She knew that about herself. She was built for action more than narration, and the things that had happened to her over the past years had reinforced a particular economy of self-expression. Say, what needs to be said, nothing extra. She looked at the room. Most of what I could say about the last 8 months, she said, is in the official record now. I'm not going to walk through it. She paused. What I want to say is something about the night itself, about what this staff did under conditions that were harder than what most of you signed up for. She looked at the nurses in the room, the residents, the paramedics who'd come in from the Bay team. You held the line, not because someone was watching, not because there was a protocol that covered it, because patients needed you to. She paused again. That's the thing nobody puts in the report. The gap between what you're supposed to do and what you actually do when it matters. That gap is where people either show up or don't. And this staff showed up. The room was very quiet. I've been in a lot of rooms, she said. A lot of buildings, in a lot of places, under conditions that this building, on its worst night, didn't approach. She wasn't saying it for effect. She was saying it because it was true, and because she'd earned the right to say it plainly. And the thing that was true in every one of those places is also true here. Competence doesn't announce itself. It just does the work. And the people who underestimate quiet competence, she stopped, thought about Holt, about Garrison, about a form filed 9 years ago that had her name in the wrong place. They pay for that eventually. The problem is that other people pay first. Nobody moved. The people who were hurt because of what was covered up, some of them are in a better place now because the record is corrected. Some of them aren't, because corrections on paper don't undo everything that paper caused. She looked at her hands for a moment. I don't have a clean ending for that. I don't think there is one. What there is what comes next. And what comes next is up to the people in this room. She looked up. So do good work. Do it when nobody's watching. Do it especially when the person who's supposed to be watching has decided you're not worth watching. She paused. That's it. The room rose. Not all at once, in the way that genuine responses happened, which was imperfectly, with some people standing before others and some people standing because others were, and the sound building from the people closest to the front outward to the back wall where Delacroix was standing. He was standing too. She stood at the front of the room and let it happen without looking for a way out of it, which was harder than it sounded for someone built the way she was built. She let it be what it was, a room full of people who had decided, for a minute, that what she represented was worth standing for. Not her, exactly. What she represented. The thing that got up when it got knocked down, not because it was dramatic or because anyone was clapping, but because getting up was the only move that made sense. She left Crestwood in May. The clinic position had been good work, and she said goodbye to it with the specific warmth of someone who'd valued a thing without being attached to it. She drove with the windows down because the weather had finally decided to be spring, and she had the field bag in the passenger seat, and she had a signed copy of her reclassified service record in the document sleeve inside it. Not because she needed to carry it, but because it belonged in the bag, with the other things the bag held. She hadn't signed the active duty continuity form. She'd thought about it for 4 months, and in the end had filed the other resolution, the clean discharge, retroactively corrected, with the proper documentation of what had actually happened. It was, in the end, the right shape. Not because military service was behind her, she wasn't certain of that, but because she needed the record to reflect the truth more than she needed it to reflect the future. The truth, for the past 4 years, had been that she was a civilian doing civilian work, carrying a wound with the wrong label on it. Now the label was right. That was enough for now. She'd told Priya, the week before she left, that she thought she'd end up back in trauma medicine. Maybe not Ohio. Maybe not a level 2 facility with ambitions and a complicated history. But trauma medicine was where her particular set of capacities was most useful, and she'd learned, slowly, through years of trying to be smaller than she was, that diminishing your usefulness to make other people comfortable was a bargain that nobody actually won. Priya had said, "Good, they'll be lucky to have you." And Claire had said, "So will you be when you figure out what to do with this floor." And Priya had laughed, the real kind, not the polite kind. And they'd left it there, which was the right place to leave it. The road opened up past the city limits, and the morning light came flat and clean across the flat Ohio landscape, and she drove into it with the particular forward quality of someone who had finished a thing and was ready, finally, to begin the next one. She'd spent 4 years being the person in the wrong margin, the person with the wrong badge and the wrong bag and the wrong kind of quiet that made people uncomfortable because it didn't ask for anything. She'd carried what she carried and worked where she worked and held the line in the way she'd always held it. Not for recognition, not for an audience, but because the alternative was to stop, and stopping had never been something she was built for. What she knew, driving out of Crestwood on a May morning with the window down and 4 years of mislabeled weight no longer sitting on her chest, was something that nobody had told her, and that she hadn't been able to learn from anything except living it. The people who dismiss you are not measuring you. They're measuring their own limited imagination of what you might be. That was it. That was the whole thing. You could waste years trying to fit inside someone else's measurement, or you could do the work, hold the line, carry the bag, and wait. Not passively, not quietly in the way of defeat, but quietly in the way of someone who knows that when the building starts burning, the person who knows what to do doesn't announce it. They just do it. And then they drive away in the morning, and the road is long, and the bag is in the passenger seat, and wherever they're going, they're ready.